What if I told you being motivated by money, status, and recognition doesn't make you shallow? It makes you human. I'm Kim Bohr, President and CEO of Spark Effect and host of the Courage to Advance podcast. Today's guest, Dr. Bobby Hoffman, spent over 20 years in corporate America before becoming a motivation researcher. And he's here to tell us why the advice from best-selling authors like Daniel Pink and Carol Dweck actually might be setting us up for failure. If you've ever felt guilty about wanting a bigger paycheck or question whether you're passionate enough about your work, this conversation is for you. Let's dive in. Dr. Hoffman, welcome to Courage to Advance.
Well, it's great to be here, Kim. I look forward to this conversation because I know it's going to be intriguing.
Indeed. I'm very excited for it and for our listeners to hear what your thoughts are on this really important topic that you have dove into in your latest book. So tell us a little bit about your background that took you from 22 years in corporate America onto this path of academia and this focus on really around passion.
Well, I think that transition was certainly a catalyst for my ongoing thoughts about the differences in types of motivation. So your listeners and you may have been in the situation where you're doing something and you're doing something well and it's lucrative, but you don't really get excited anymore, and your values shift over the course of time. And there's a direct correlation between the grayness of your hair and the concern that you have for how much time you have left on the planet. So my motivation, my personal reasoning for transitioning from a corporate consultant in human resources, organizational development, and performance management to academia was a combination of wanting a new and consistent challenge because, frankly, after doing the same thing over and over for 20 years, I was getting bored. There wasn't any challenge for me. And secondly, I do have strong extrinsic motivation, meaning that I'm interested in influence, helping others because of the recognition that I get as a result of that. I'm not really materialistic, but I do have specific goals, and those related around having more control over my time. So if you're familiar with the academic lifestyle, it's very different from the corporate lifestyle when you have external demands on your time. In academia, you set your agenda and you set your time frames. And as long as you're productive, you can work when you want and not work when you want. So it was partially a lifestyle change, but partially an intellectual challenge.
I love it. And so your book is called The Paradox of Passion. And you really argue that much of what we believe about motivation is myths. I know you really challenge some of the maybe more common household names that people have heard in some of the ways that motivation has often been, shared with many of us. And so when you think about that transition you made, what was the moment that, or maybe it was an experience that you realized that motivation was really fundamentally wrong in the way it was being discussed? And what drove you really to write this book in particular?
Well, I'm not sure I had that revelation at the time of the transition, but I did realize just in the first couple of weeks of my PhD program that all of the typical behaviors in corporate America were much more intuitive and lacked the measurement emphasis and the rigor that you really want when you're making multi-million-dollar financial decisions, which most of my clients did. So I began to go through this intellectual transition where, what I thought I knew about motivation was not necessarily what it actually was based upon all the information that was out there. But the passion narrative really developed from my experiences with my students. Since I teach a class in motivation, and I like to know what my students get out of that class, I actually ask them, unlike the typical end of class surveys where they say, was the instructor good? And did you feel that you learned anything? I asked them what they learned. And almost 100% consistency, they said, well, I thought I was motivated by the sheer pleasure of attaining new knowledge and bettering my situation intellectually and feeling good about myself. And that's why I majored in the subjects that they majored in. And over the course, I found out, you know what? I'm almost 100% extrinsically motivated, meaning they were motivated by grades or the prospect of making more money or getting a better job or getting recognition from their friends or family. So this planted this seed in my head. Well, let me do some deeper research. And I also had fundamental knowledge of many motivation theories. And as I dug deeper and deeper into the actual research, I found that lots of times we're disguising or misinterpreting our motives. And I usually go through this exercise, and I could actually do it with you. It'll take about 5 minutes, and ask you your motivations. And what happens at the end of the conversation? People who claim to be pursuing things for passion in actuality aren't doing that. So we couple that with the fact that most jobs, not necessarily the jobs that you and I have, but a large majority of the global population are invested in 8-hour-long activities that don't even provide the opportunity for passion. So a combination of these things said, you know what? I need to discuss the paradox of passion, because it's great to have passion, but is that passion sustainable over the long term? And is it even available in most of the opportunities that we encounter?
I think it's such an important topic too, especially there's always disruption anymore in our world, whether that's in our professional lives or our personal lives. I think often we hear people talk about it as there's constant change. And I think because of that, having this better sense, I think we put more pressure on ourselves as to what motivates us in that traditional way of thinking. And I've even got a son that's a sophomore in college. And although he has a really strong sense of the work he's doing and what he's studying and he's excited about, I will find these moments recently where he said, I'm just, I'm not sure where he was trying to find that intrinsic motivation and not realizing that much of that, as you described, the extrinsic factors are completely okay to embrace. And I think there's this sense of perhaps, guilt maybe sometimes that those extrinsic right? Yeah. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and help people see that maybe it's okay. It doesn't all have to be we don't have to have that such an intrinsic feeling about it all.
You've hit on so many really important issues, Kim. It's funny that you brought up your son, because one of the most widespread and methodologically sound studies of 6 million college students, and that sample is astronomical, found that for the most part it's extrinsic factors that drive their motivation. And when we look at society and social media, usually in Western countries like the United States and Canada, we see there's a large, we'll say, prevailing train of thought that says you should follow your dreams. You should not waste your time in things that don't provide purpose and meaning to you. So the popular narrative is passion is good. And alternatively, if you're interested in power, influence, recognition, and wealth, you are actually vilified in many circles of society, which leads us to one of the main paradoxes, being that we feel guilty
yes,
for pursuing our passion And passion is very subjective. But if
Mhm.
that means I want more money or I want more influence, I want to be an influencer, I want to be on
Yeah.
TikTok. And there may be something wrong with you.
Right.
And that's where the problem really manifests into other things, because if we don't believe in ourselves, we start to generate this self-doubt, and we say, well, why aren't I passionate? What's wrong with me? I keep hearing everybody tells me I should be passionate and find my dreams. But the way motivation works, it's not a linear uphill path. There are peaks and valleys, and we need to know how to respond to those, because we don't want to get into situations of self-doubt, because self-doubt leads to frustration. Frustration leads to anxiety. It is inevitable to have motivational crashes. So the pursuit of the passion narrative, if you think that's how the world operates, you can be very disenchanted. And in the worst case, it results in depression. And if you think about the classic moments where people have these motivational lulls, obviously your mother, so you know what happens after birth. You're like, okay, now what?
Or when your child goes to college and doesn't need you in the same ways that they used to.
So we have all these milestones in relationships and careers and life in general, and then we have these crashes. And if we don't use strategies that align with how our brain works, we run the risk of getting into a lot of trouble that people don't even think about.
One of the things that stands out too about what you said around that extrinsic motivation of money and earnings in particular, when we work with leaders, there's often this apology from people of when we use different tools, or it just comes out in the different work we do. And they'll say, yeah, I mean, it's like this apology of wanting to make money as a motivating factor. It's like, why are you apologizing? And it's just so fascinating to find, especially, I don't know, I guess maybe in more cultures than just our Western culture, that's perhaps, it doesn't mean you still can't be generous and charitable. It seems like people feel like you can't have both.
Well, we have evil terminology such as narcissism and being self-absorbed when you're focusing on what you perceive or what I describe as being rewarded. So the reward conceptions for people vary tremendously. And even within our own selves, what we consider to be rewarding at a particular time will change based on the task and where we are in that cycle. So specifically for students, they're very gung-ho when they start in a course and they proclaim that they're looking for mastery of material. And then they get that first tidbit of, we'll say, frank feedback from an instructor. And it's, oh no, now my motivation is now shifting because I'm concerned about my performance. That's another paradox that we encounter with what I describe as mythical passion, because it's not sustainable over the long term. So I use the analogy, it's kind of like being out in the sun. Being out in the sun is really good for you. Passion is great. But what happens if you stay out in the sun too long?
Right.
You get sunburnt. And what happens if you're passionate and you encounter one of these blips on the motivational radar and you're in a down cycle? You get burnt out. So, and I really ultimately wrote the book to help other people have better lives and understand what's going on inside your head and why it's happening neurologically. But it's kind of like anything else. Too much of a good thing is not a good thing.
Right. Finding those trade-offs and having the tools to weather the ups and downs is a healthy aspect of what you're really prescribing, it seems.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you want to know how to cope. I would have to say in the majority of cases, our coping strategies are very risk tolerant because we do things that will satisfy our brain at a particular time. We like those quick hits. So if you're feeling depressed, what do you do first? Well, in my case, it's usually I open the refrigerator and eat some garbage food because you say, well, what the hell? I need something to keep me going. This will make me feel good for an instant. And
So
that's
true.
okay. That's okay too. But if then you divert to that method of achieving your motivational contentment and that drives your behavior, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. So that's why we have obesity, and that's why we have substance abuse and addiction. And that is also why we have people who are workaholics, because it all serves the same purpose to reward your brain. Your brain doesn't really care in terms of how it's satisfied, as long as it is satisfied.
It's
a variety
critical,
of drugs, piece of chocolate,
all those become these short-term. Yeah, they become these short-term,
right.
stopgaps for something that isn't necessarily the
well,
most.
It's temporary relief, but it certainly doesn't address the cause of the neurological letdown, because we can become habituated to that. And we don't want that habit. So, it's really hard for someone who gets satisfaction from a certain behavior to say, cold turkey, go on a diet. What percentage of diets do you think don't work?
Oh, yes.
I don't know the exact number,
but it's quite high.
Yeah,
right.
It's certainly statistically significant. And the same thing with any other activity that we need to know the strategies to, number one, avoid the deep chasms of the motivational low, but also to reflect appropriately on the highs so you don't get too satisfied and too overwhelmed as well. So it's a tricky business.
It is.
And really it boils down to self-management.
Absolutely.
That's ultimately what it is.
Many executives have discovered that traditional motivational strategies fall short, as we've been talking about. And you call passion this motivation unicorn and really argue that rewards get unfairly demonized. Can you, for leaders who really want to build what we call this trust elasticities, we have put out research that shows the ability for trust to be able to grow, actually. And if organizations handle disruption in a really well orchestrated way, the trust can actually grow even greater than perhaps what the baseline was based on this research. And so for leaders who are trying to drive change and navigating all this disruption and trying to motivate employees, what do you think how are they falling short? What are some of the things that maybe, even when you reflected back to your corporate days, you would have maybe approached differently having this knowledge now?
One of the reasons that I have so much gray hair is because I used to be responsible for reductions in force and performance management, helping people out the door and closing down offices. And I've conducted a wide variety of change management training. And this is where the distinction comes in between experience and intuition, that is usually the driver at the corporate level, and research-supported evidence. And most leaders don't think about, and I write about this extensively in Paradox of Passion, is that the fundamental behavior of every individual is based on really two things: the mental models that they have about how the world operates, and the mental models they have about themselves. And we call this in psychology self-beliefs. And there are a number of very instrumental self-beliefs. Number one being, how much control do I feel I have on the outcomes that I achieve? So if you think about that, if you believe you're able to orchestrate your path in life, you have an elevated control belief, or what we call with the jargon, an internal locus of control, which basically means you can control your destiny. And it doesn't matter what other people want to do. You're just going to navigate that change in the way that you'll navigate it to reach your personal goals. Alternatively, you can have an external locus of control where you relinquish responsibility for your fate and your development. And you say, oh, well, economic conditions determine what's going to happen to me. And there's nothing I can do about it. I was born into poverty and I'm going to stay that way because what can I do? So I'm not passing judgment on either one of those, but I will say that individuals with an internal focus use different strategies than people with an external focus. Why bother to try and go through career development if you think it's beyond your control, or it's based on who you know, not what you know, or you're locked into a certain culture or mindset? Doesn't matter. So going back to your point of when we have these change initiatives, most of them focus on what leadership wants to accomplish, not what the individual wants to accomplish. So if we relate that to trust, and I define trust as a fundamental human need, but it's interwoven with many other things, that including some of the things that I just discussed. So you can imagine if you have an external locus of control and you're projecting your destiny on others, well, you would have to trust them. But if you're like the large majority of the people that corporations like to employ, their concern is not about the agenda of the organization, but how they integrate with that organization. So I found through my change initiatives that leaders don't think about it at all as, well, what do we want to accomplish? And how do we persuade our, I'll call them employees, I'd rather say our clients, but they don't necessarily act like they would with their clients. They treat them differently. So you get this disconnect between individual mental models and beliefs about themselves. Some people may have a belief, well, nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm going to determine what I do. And here we have the corporate executives say, if you want to be successful in this organization, so I'm sure that you know this from your consulting experience, what happens during the change initiatives? Usually the best people leave.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Completely opposite.
You want to keep.
Right.
And you're left with those that they may be perfect employees, but do you want people that conform and comply? Or do you want people in your organization that have avid participation, that are your best champions of the business, that they're so proud of where they work that they recruit others into the organization? Or do you want people that go home and grumble and say, oh, I made it through another day?
Right. And it is a choice, right? It's a choice. And there's a lot of design strategy in that, and how we think about building that trust within people by the choices we make and how we handle all those micro situations that happen on a day-to-day basis.
I do think a lot of leaders look at things from their own perspective, and it certainly makes perfect sense because their mental models evolve around the strategy that they want to implement, but it may be inconsistent with that of their employee clients. And ultimately, and from looking at your work, I know you know this, but I don't think a lot of the leaders that I've worked with, and I worked with people making $1 million a year, and I worked at the NBA and 30 Rockefeller Center with these high-flying media executives. And, it's usually all about them, and no one will focus on strategic objectives when they have personal issues that are still on the table. And sometimes those are discounted during change initiatives.
Absolutely. So in your book, you introduce the concept of homeostasis, the psychological balance of optimal functioning. Can you talk a little bit more about that and where that comes into play?
Well, I should be admonished and slapped around for inventing terminology because I advocate not to do that, because what happens, and this is more of an academic issue, you have the same concept called different things by 10 different people.
Right.
And it just confuses people. And then you have different concepts with the same the same label. So it gets all jumbled. It's called the jingle jangle fallacy. But in sixth grade, and human biology, we learned about homeostasis and the body's goal of regulating our nervous system. So what does that mean in plain English? When we're hungry, we eat. Mm-hmm. When we need excitement, we do a lot of different things. When we get too excited, we rest. Mm-hmm. So I'm just applying the same principles of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems to motivation, because if we're constantly on the go, we will get burnt out. And a lot of, we'll say, experts, otherwise known as motivational speakers, will advocate, keep going, pursue your goals, don't stop, never give up, it discounts the principles of how the brain works. We need this time to recover. And so we can't have sustained motivation over a long period of time. So I invented this term that relates to homeostasis, but why wouldn't homeostasis apply to anything else? There's something called allostasis, which refers to our ability to reduce stress. So when we're highly stressed out and it begins to impact us both psychologically and biologically, we take deliberate steps and our body kicks in our immune system. So it kind of heightens our awareness. So homeostasis is just another convenient term to describe the goal of the individual to have even keel in their motivation.
Recognizing the different extrinsic and intrinsic factors and recognizing that how they all come together is part of that strategy to use that way.
Yeah. This book came out in 2017 and people are still buying it because a lot of it is very straightforward. And it's not an academic book at all. This is a book that many people just buy off the shelf because it's humorous and it tells stories, but a huge section is called the awareness hacks. So creating that awareness for people of those motivational highs and lows, and when they're getting out of balance, it's almost like people who have type 2 diabetes, they monitor their
the glucose
the glucose. I can't think of the number, but it's the same sort of monitoring thing where you consciously think about it. A lot of these things related to your questioning are enhanced by bringing into the forefront of our minds what is actually happening, because we tend to defer the thinking process whenever we can. Given the choice between using our cognitive horsepower and not, if the payoff is the same, we'll always take the easy route. Mm-hmm. So this is why we have things called rules of thumb and heuristics and algorithms, because it makes the thinking process simpler. We do not like, as human beings, to invest effort if it can be avoided and still get the same outcome. So the awareness and the strategies to deliberately and intentionally create that awareness by saying things like, how might I be getting this wrong? Mm-hmm. What are some other interpretations? when was I successful in my thinking process and my behavior to reach very challenging goals? Am I examining all of the evidence, or am I just seeking out things that support my point? All of these types of strategies that I just label as hacks, because that's what sold books in 2017, but they're all related to the awareness, doing a psychological inventory of our approach. How do I interact with different people at different times, sometimes with the same issues? How come I let certain things roll off the top of my head and I latch on to others and get excited? Why do I get angry in certain situations and not others? So if we can consciously become aware of those, then we can implement strategies in the event that we're motivated to make the change.
What do you feel like are the most important elements of this new book of yours, The Paradox of Passion, that you really want to make sure people understand and they take away and they apply?
Well, first, I don't want people to feel guilty or have self-doubt because they're motivated by things other than sheer pleasure. There is nothing wrong with wanting to receive recognition from others. It's part of many of the most well-researched theories in motivation. There's nothing wrong with influence. There's nothing wrong with having rewards that are materialistic. That's one point. The second point is that the rewards that we set should always be within our discretion, meaning we control how those rewards are administered when they're obtained. And now I'm talking about rewards. I'm talking everything from having your favorite meal, or having a piece of candy, or taking a social media break, or finding a cure for cancer. The subjectivity of reward is something that leaders and individuals should consider, because you really can't try and provide a motivational model without knowing that. So that's very important. And the understanding that change is actually possible. There are people that can fight addiction. There are people that can get rejuvenated after achieving a milestone and go on to something bigger and better. So the strategies that I wouldn't say I've invented any of them. What I have done is aggregated them and simplified them so individuals can go to The Paradox of Passion, as well as the other book, and say, okay, I can apply this in my own life. Because I found from working with my students and working with leaders, nobody wants to hear about theory unless you're a researcher or unless you're a student accountable for knowing the theory. We want to, what do I do with this information?
Right.
This is why I'm here for people to use my information. I don't really care if they buy the book, but if they buy the books, it'll be better for them. And I'll get the recognition that I feel, my ideas are being embraced by other people. But they can go to Psychology Today, where I have over 100 articles, where I take all this complicated research that my much smarter colleagues conduct, and I transform that into stuff that you can use, that you can apply. And so for me, that's the most important takeaway, that I deconstruct this complex neurological information and kind of whittle it down to say, okay, now that we know this, and I become aware of it, does it help me be a better person, to be more effective? And number two, how can I use it to improve my own life and the lives of others?
I love that. And can you hold up both your books again? I want to make sure we capture that, and that I realize.
What if I have more than two? I'm in trouble.
Well, the two, right. So The Paradox of Passion is your most recent. And Hack Your Motivation is the other book you were referencing.
Right.
That I hope our listeners will invest in getting both of those. And Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for the time. It's been a real pleasure and an educational opportunity for myself to think about this differently as well. So I'm very pleased that you took the time to speak with us today.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we could go for another couple of hours.
I know. There's a lot of richness
barely
here.
Scratched the surface. But it was great talking to you, Kim, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I think is valuable information.
Thank you so much. For our listeners, we have free resources relevant to our conversation today that you can download by visiting courage2advancepodcast.com, which will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page. And we'll have links to Dr. Bobby Hoffman's books in the show notes, as well as to some of the articles he mentioned from his Psychology Today publishing. Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them.